Midnight horror stories. These are the stories people tell quietly, late at night, to the one person they trust. Tonight, you're that person. Turn off the lights.
"12 years in an Ozark fire tower. Something climbed it. My name doesn't matter for this. What matters is that for 12 seasons, from the time I was 26 until I was 38, I worked as a fire lookout and backcountry patrol technician for the Forest Service, stationed in the Ozark St. Francis National Forest, up in the Boston Mountains district of Arkansas. Most people don't know the Ozarks have real wilderness left in them. They picture rolling hills, maybe a lake, maybe a country road with a gas station on it. They don't picture what's actually back in there. Hollows that drop 300 feet in half a mile. Sinkholes big enough to swallow a truck. Cave systems that nobody has finished mapping, some of them going back so deep the survey teams turn around not because they hit the end, but because they run out of daylight and nerve. My job, on paper, was simple. From April through October, I lived most days in a steel tower 100 feet off the ground, on a ridge called Hurricane Point, watching for smoke. When there wasn't smoke to watch for, which was most days, I did backcountry patrol on foot and on a Forest Service ATV, checking trail conditions, clearing blowdown, doing wildlife counts for the district biologist, and generally being the only human being for a very long way in any direction. I want to be clear about that isolation before I go further, because everything that happened to me only makes sense once you understand how alone I really was. On a slow week, I might see 3 other people. On a slow month, 1. The nearest paved road was 11 miles from my tower by trail, longer by vehicle. The district itself covered roughly 40,000 acres. Most of its second-growth hardwood forest that had reclaimed old homestead land through the middle of the last century, laced with the kind of karst geology that makes the Ozarks genuinely strange country if you spend enough time in it. Limestone under almost everything, which means water doesn't behave the way it does in granite or sandstone country. It goes underground, sometimes for miles, resurfacing in springs that seem to come from nowhere, disappearing into sinks that seem to lead nowhere. There were caves on the district maps that had official names and survey numbers, and there were caves that didn't, entrances the old-timers knew about and the agency didn't. Some of them collapsed or hidden enough that even a careful hiker could walk within 20 feet and never see them. I mention all of this because I think the ground itself matters to this story. Whatever I lived through for 12 years didn't happen in ordinary forest. It happened in country that is, by any geologist's honest account, hollow underneath, riddled with passages nobody has fully mapped, and I've come to believe that fact is not incidental to what I experienced up there. I took the job because I liked being alone. I want that on the record too. I wasn't a nervous person. I'd done 2 seasons in Alaska before that, on a trail crew, and I'd spent a summer as a raft guide in Idaho. I was used to bears, used to weather, used to the ordinary fear that comes with wild country and knows its own name. What happened in the Ozarks was different, and it took me years to admit that difference to myself, because admitting it meant admitting I didn't have a name for what I was afraid of. I think it's worth explaining, briefly, why I trusted my own judgment enough, in the years that followed, to take any of this seriously rather than dismissing it outright the way a lot of people would in my position. I don't scare easily, and I'm not prone to superstition. I grew up on a working farm, not in a city, and I'd spent enough nights alone in genuinely dangerous wild country by the time I took the Hurricane Point job to have already built a reliable internal sense of the difference between ordinary unease and something worth paying real attention to. I'd been bluff charged by a grizzly in Alaska and kept my head enough to do the right thing and walk away unhurt. I mentioned that only to establish a baseline, because everything that follows has to be read against a person who had already proven to himself, in a genuinely life-threatening moment, that he did not panic easily and did not see danger where none existed. That baseline is the only credibility I have to offer you, 12 years and one long account later, and I've decided it's worth offering plainly, up front, rather than letting you wonder the whole way through whether I'm the kind of person prone to exaggerating a strange noise into something more than it was. I'm going to tell you what happened in order, season by season, because the order matters. It didn't start as anything you'd call frightening. It built. That's the part people don't understand when I try to explain it to them now. It's not one bad night. It's 12 years of a slow, patient escalation, and by the end of it, I had stopped asking what it was and started only asking how to keep it from getting closer. My first season. My first season on Hurricane Point was quiet, at least at first, and I want to walk through the ordinary parts of the job so you understand the baseline, the normal texture of nights up there, before anything changed. The tower itself was a standard air motor-style steel structure, catwalk around the cab, a wood stove inside for the cold nights, propane for cooking, a hand-crank radio, and a solar-charged two-way for contact with the district office. I slept in the cab most nights, though there was a small cabin at the base of the tower stairs I used in bad weather. 60-some steps up to the cab. I counted them so many times over the years I could do it in my sleep, and some nights I did. The hollows around the tower had names, old ones, most of them going back to families who'd farmed and hunted this country before the Forest Service bought it up in the 1930s. Slaughter Hollow, Devil's Kitchen, Coffin Creek. I used to think those names were just the ordinary, colorful violence of old Ozark place naming, the same way you get a Bloody Run or a Massacre Creek in half the mountain counties in America. I don't think that anymore. I think, now, that some of those names were warnings put down by people who didn't have any other way to write them down. The first thing I noticed, and it took most of that first season to notice it because I didn't have anything to compare it to yet, was the quiet. Not silence. The Ozarks are loud at night, in early summer, whip-poor wills, katydids, the occasional coyote chorus rolling up out of the hollows. What I mean is a specific, localized quiet, a stretch of maybe 200 or 300 yards down toward Coffin Creek where, on certain nights, the insects would simply stop. Not fade. Stop, all at once, like someone had cut a switch. I'd stand on the catwalk with my binoculars and watch that dark patch of canopy and feel the hair go up on my arms, and I could never see anything. And after a few minutes, the insects would start again just as suddenly, and I'd tell myself it was an owl passing through, or a bobcat, something that spooked the bugs the way a predator will. There was, before all of that, an earlier and much smaller thing I noticed about the radio static that I should describe properly, because it turned out, over the following years, to be one of the most consistent threads running through this whole account. Carol had told me every tower picked up occasional static from atmospheric bounce off the ridge topography, and for most of that first season, I had no reason to doubt her. But somewhere around midsummer, lying awake on a warm, still night with the two-way turned low on the shelf beside my cot, I started to notice that the static wasn't quite the featureless hiss I'd have expected from a genuine radio artifact. It had a rhythm buried in it, faint, easy to dismiss as pattern matching on pure noise, the way people hear voices in white noise machines or ocean waves, but persistent enough, night after night, that I eventually started timing it against my watch out of simple boredom. It came, more nights than not, in bursts of roughly the same duration, 3 to 5 seconds, spaced unevenly, sometimes minutes apart, sometimes not recurring for the rest of the night after a single burst. I never once, across 12 years, made out anything I could honestly call a word inside that static. I want to be completely clear about that, because I think claiming otherwise would be a step past what I actually experienced into something I only ever suspected. What I can say is that by my third or fourth season, I had stopped believing it was atmospheric bounce and had never told Carol or anyone else at the district office that I'd stopped believing it. By August of that first season, I'd started keeping a small notebook, not because I thought anything supernatural was happening, but because keeping notes is just what you do in that job, and because I'm the kind of person who likes a record. I wrote down the quiet patches. I wrote down the nights the two-way radio picked up a burst of static right around 2 or 3 in the morning, a specific kind of static, rhythmic almost, that the district dispatcher, a woman named Carol who'd worked that desk for 11 years, told me not to worry about. Every tower gets that, she said. Something to do with the ridge topography and atmospheric bounce. Old towers especially. I believed her. I had no reason not to. Near the end of that first season, in late September, I had my first real incident, though at the time I filed it under strange rather than frightening. I'd gone down from the tower before first light to check a trail camera the district biologist had set up near a bench above Coffin Creek, part of a deer population study. It was maybe 40 minutes before sunrise, headlamp on, dew heavy on the ferns. About 200 yards from the camera site, I heard what I can only describe as a call. Not a bird. Not a coyote. A long, rising note, almost like someone yodeling, except it had a strange, thin quality to it, like it was coming from somewhere much farther away than it sounded, or from underground. It lasted maybe 4 seconds and stopped clean, no fade, no echo tapering off the way a real sound does in that terrain. I stood still for a long time after that. I want to be honest that my first reaction wasn't fear so much as confusion, the kind of confusion where your brain runs through a checklist of known animals and comes up empty on all of them. Elk had been reintroduced to parts of the Ozarks by then, and elk makes strange sounds, bugling especially, so I told myself, on the walk back up, that it had probably been an elk, even though something in me knew the timbre was wrong. Knew it in the same automatic way you know a person's voice is wrong on the phone before you can say why. I checked the trail camera 2 days later. Nothing unusual on it. Deer, one bobcat, a raccoon working the bait station. I wrote the incident down in my notebook as early AM call, unknown source, POS, elk, and didn't think much more about it. There was one more small thing from that first season, small enough that I almost don't include it, except that in hindsight it was the first time the pattern touched the tower itself rather than the hollow below it. In early October, my last week before closing the tower for the winter, I came back from a supply run to find that the propane cylinder I kept staged at the base of the stairs, a heavy steel tank I could barely drag myself, had been moved. Not far. Maybe 4 feet, from where it always sat against the cabin wall to a spot out in the open, upright, perfectly balanced on its base in a way that made no sense for wind or animal disturbance to have caused. I remember standing there turning it over in my mind, checking for tracks, checking for any sign a bear had rolled it, and finding nothing, no drag marks in the dirt, no scuffing, as if it had simply been picked up and set back down somewhere else. I told myself, at the time, that I must have misremembered where I'd left it. I want to be honest that I did not fully believe that explanation even as I made it. That first season ended a few days later with the first hard frost, and I came down off the mountain and went home for the winter, and I didn't think about Hurricane Point again until the following April. Season 2. My second season, I want to be clear, was mostly ordinary too, and I think that ordinariness matters because it's part of what made the pattern, once I finally saw it, so hard to accept. This wasn't a haunted tower in the way people like to imagine those things, all string and drama. It was months of nothing, and then something small, and then months of nothing again. That rhythm is, I've come to believe, the actual signature of whatever this is. It doesn't want to be noticed as a pattern. It wants each incident to feel isolated, explainable, forgettable. The quiet patches down toward Coffin Creek continued that second season, and by midsummer I'd noticed they were slightly larger, encompassing a wider stretch of hollow than the year before, though I want to be honest that this could easily have been my imagination filling in a memory that was already a year old and getting hazier. I don't put much weight on that particular observation. I put more weight on what happened in July. I was on backcountry patrol, checking a stretch of the Ozark Highlands Trail that runs along the ridge above Devil's Kitchen, clearing some blowdown from a spring storm. It was mid-afternoon, full daylight, which matters, because most of what I'm going to tell you happened at night or in low light, and this did not. I'd stopped to drink water and eat a granola bar sitting on a downed oak, maybe half a mile from the nearest trailhead, when I became aware, in the specific way you become aware of being watched, that something was on the slope below me, in the hollow, looking up. I didn't see it. I want to be precise about that because precision is the only thing that's kept me credible to myself over the years. I did not see a shape, a figure, an animal, anything. What I had was a location, a very specific patch of understory, maybe 80 yards downslope, dense with young pine and greenbrier, that my attention kept snapping back to, the way your eye gets pulled to a person staring at you across a room before your conscious mind has clocked why. I sat very still for what felt like a long time. Nothing moved down there. No branch snapped, no bird flushed, nothing. And yet the feeling did not fade the way a false alarm fades. It held steady, and then it got stronger, and then, all at once, it was gone, like a hand had been lifted off the back of my neck. I finished my patrol that day faster than I needed to. I didn't run. I want to say that clearly, because in the stories people tell about this kind of thing, there's always a moment of panic and flight, and that's not what this was, not yet. It was a controlled, deliberate decision to be somewhere else, made by a part of my brain that I don't think consults with the rational part before it decides these things. There was a second incident that same season, a few weeks later, that I've always thought of as connected to the first, though I have no way to prove that beyond the geography lining up. I was doing an evening radio check from the catwalk, going through the routine of reporting visibility and conditions to the district dispatcher, when I noticed, in the last gray light before true dark, a disturbance moving through the canopy along the same slope above Devil's Kitchen where I'd felt watched weeks earlier. I want to stress that I did see something that time, or saw the effect of something, a slow, deliberate shivering of treetops moving in a straight line across the slope, the kind of disturbance a heavy animal moving through brush will sometimes cause, except that it crossed open ground between two stands of timber, a gap of maybe 30 feet with no cover at all, without any pause, and without, as far as I could tell through binoculars and fading light, any visible body crossing that gap. The canopy on the far side simply started moving again, as though whatever caused it had either covered that open stretch faster than anything I've ever seen move, or hadn't needed to touch the ground to cross it at all. I didn't sleep well that night. I remember sitting up in the cab with the propane lantern turned up brighter than I usually ran it, telling myself every rational explanation I could think of and not fully believing any of them. That was the last incident of my second season. I finished out the year without further note, other than an increasing habit of checking the notebook against itself, comparing dates, looking for a rhythm I told myself I wasn't looking for. Season 3, and the first other voice. It was in my third season that I first heard, from another person, that I wasn't the only one who'd noticed something about that stretch of the district. This is the corroboration I mentioned, and I want to walk through it carefully, because it's the piece of this whole account that moved things, for me, from I might be imagining things to something is actually here. There was an old man named Delbert Suggs who lived on a piece of family land bordering the national forest boundary, down near where Coffin Creek eventually runs into a bigger drainage. His family had owned that ground, or parts of it, since before the Forest Service existed, and the Forest Service, in the way these things often go in the Ozarks, had bought up the land around his in-holding decades earlier, leaving him surrounded on 3 sides by federal timber. He was somewhere in his 70s by the time I met him, sharp as anything, ran a few cattle, hunted the same ridges his father and grandfather had hunted. I met him because a cow had gotten through a fence onto Forest Service land, and I helped him drive it back. We got to talking, the way you do, and I mentioned, carefully, feeling foolish even as I said it, that I'd noticed some odd, quiet patches down toward Coffin Creek from the tower. I expected him to laugh it off. He didn't. He got very still, the way people get when you've said something they've been waiting a long time for someone else to say first, and he said, "You mean down below the point, where the ground goes soft?" I asked him what he meant by soft ground, and he told me there was an old sink down in there, a collapsed section of cave roof, that his father had fenced off when Delbert was a boy because cattle kept refusing to graze anywhere near it, not from fear of falling in, he said, but a different kind of refusal, the kind you see in an animal that won't walk into a barn where something's wrong. He said his father had lost 2 dogs down in that hollow over the years, good dogs, dogs that didn't run off, dogs that were simply never seen again after chasing something down into the trees near the sink. He told me, and I want to represent this as exactly what it was, an old man's family story, not a confirmed fact, that his grandfather used to talk about a call that came up out of that hollow on certain nights, a call the old-timers wouldn't answer, because the local belief, going back generations before the Forest Service and before most of the roads, was that whatever made the sound could learn a voice by hearing it answered, and having learned it, would use it. He didn't use any particular name for whatever this was. He was careful about that, the way people from that country are often careful, like naming a thing gives it a foothold you don't want it to have. He just called it, when he called it anything, what's down in the sink. I asked him if he still avoided the area. He said he did, and that he'd told his own kids to do the same, though his kids had mostly moved off to Fort Smith and Fayetteville and didn't spend much time on the family ground anymore. He said something else, too, that I've turned over in my mind 100 times since. He said the old people used to believe you could tell how bad a season was going to be by how far the quiet had spread, and that when he was young, the quiet had barely reached the fence line. By the time I met him, it had crossed onto Forest Service land and, by his account, kept creeping. Before I left his place that day, I asked him, carefully, whether he himself had ever experienced anything directly, rather than just inheriting the stories from his father and grandfather. He was quiet for a while, working a piece of fence wire between his fingers, and then he told me about a night when he was maybe 19, coon hunting with 2 dogs along the rim above the sink, well before the Forest Service owned any of the surrounding land, when both his dogs had gone silent mid-chase, all at once, the way trained hounds simply do not do once they're locked onto a scent trail. He said he'd called them back and they'd come immediately, both of them, bellies low to the ground, and that as he'd turned to head home he'd heard, from down in the sink, something that started as a fair imitation of his own father's voice calling his name, close enough in the first half-second that he'd nearly answered on reflex, before something in the pitch slid wrong partway through the word, dropping into a register no human throat produces, and he'd run the better part of a mile without. Looking back, dogs pressed against his legs the whole way, and had never hunted that rim again after dark in the more than 50 years since. He told me he'd never told his own wife the full detail of that night, only that he didn't care for that stretch of ground, and that I was, as far as he knew, the first person outside his own family he'd ever described it to in full. I want to be honest that I didn't fully believe him at the time, or rather, I believed that he believed it, and I filed it as a piece of colorful local folklore layered onto a real geological feature, a sinkhole, that probably did have some genuine hazard to it, unstable ground, bad air, something that would spook cattle and dogs for perfectly mundane reasons. It wasn't until later seasons that I started to weigh his account differently. That same fall, curious in a way I couldn't quite explain to myself, I made a trip into town on one of my days off and spent an afternoon at the County Historical Society, a small room above the library staffed by a volunteer who clearly didn't get many visitors asking the kinds of questions I was asking. I told her I was interested in old place names and local history around the Hurricane Point area, which was true enough not to feel like a lie. She pulled out a few boxes of unindexed material, newspaper clippings, church records, a handful of oral history transcripts done by a college folklore project back in the 1970s, most of it never published anywhere. I found two things that afternoon that I copied down and kept. The first was a short item from a county newspaper dated 1931, reporting that a hunting party had abandoned a planned overnight trip near what the article called the Coffin Creek breaks, after what one member described only as disturbances in the night that could not be accounted for, language vague enough to have meant almost anything, but specific enough in its refusal to elaborate that it read, to me, like every hedge I'd already heard from Wayne Pruitt and the Cave Crew leader years, before either of them existed to say it. The second was a fragment of one of the 1970s oral history transcripts, an interview with a woman then in her 80s who had grown up on a farm near the forest boundary, in which she was recorded saying, and I copied this down word for word at the time, that her family never let the little ones play down toward the sink past supper, on account of it learning their voices too easy, and a child's voice is the easiest of all to borrow. The folklore project interviewer, to their credit, had apparently pressed her on what she meant by borrow, and her answer, transcribed exactly, was simply, "You'll know it if you ever hear your own child call you from somewhere your child isn't." I sat with that transcript for a long time in that small room above the library. I didn't have children of my own, still don't, and I remember being grateful for that, in a strange, cold way, sitting there, before I'd even fully decided whether I believed any of it. I went back to that same historical society twice more over the following years, and the volunteer, a patient woman named Sandra who eventually stopped asking why a Forest Service employee kept requesting the same unindexed box, helped me track down two more fragments from that 1970s folklore project, neither as vivid as the woman's account about borrowed voices, but both consistent with the same broad pattern, references to livestock refusing certain pastures, to a specific stretch of ridge. Families avoided after dark going back, by the interviewee's own estimates, at least 3 generations before the interviews were recorded. None of it would hold up as rigorous historical evidence in any formal sense. Oral history is porous, filtered through decades of retelling, shaped by whatever a family already believed before an interviewer ever arrived with a tape recorder. But taken together, box after box, decade after decade, family after unrelated family, it built a weight of accumulated, independent testimony that I found harder to dismiss with each visit, and that weight, more than any single piece of evidence on its own, is what finally moved me, somewhere around my 4th or 5th season, from treating this as an open question to treating it as a known, if unnamed, feature of the ground I worked. Season 4, The Trail Camera. My 4th season brought the first piece of what I'd call physical evidence, and I want to present it plainly, without overclaiming what it shows, because I've seen too many people online take an ambiguous trail camera image and build a whole mythology on top of it, and I don't want to do that here. I'm just going to describe what was on the card. The district biologist, a woman named Priya who ran the deer and turkey monitoring program for our section of the forest, had a network of maybe 15 trail cameras scattered through the district, and checking them was part of my regular patrol duties. One of those cameras sat on a bench above Coffin Creek, not far from where I'd heard that early morning call back in my 1st season. In early June of my 4th year, I pulled the card from that camera and, back at the tower that evening, went through the images on my laptop the way I did every couple of weeks. Most of it was the usual: deer, a bear that had been showing up more that year, wild turkey, a bobcat once. And then there was a sequence, for consecutive frames taken about 8 seconds apart, triggered sometime around 3:40 in the morning, that showed something at the very edge of the frame that I still cannot explain to my satisfaction. It wasn't a clear shape. Trail cameras at night use infrared flash, and anything at the margin of the frame, especially anything moving, tends to blur and wash out. What I can tell you is that across those 4 frames, there was a tall, pale vertical mass, roughly at the height a standing person would occupy relative to the surrounding brush, that appeared, held for 2 frames, and then was gone in the 3rd, with the 4th frame showing nothing but disturbed undergrowth where it had been. I sent the images to Priya and to 2 friends from my Alaska Trail crew days who'd both spent years around bears and understood animal movement and camera behavior better than most people. Priya's read was that it was most likely a bear standing upright, momentarily, at a bad angle relative to the flash, which is a real thing that happens and produces genuinely eerie-looking images more often than people realize. My friends were split, one leaning toward the bear explanation, the other saying flatly that the proportions looked wrong to him, too tall and too narrow through the body for any bear he'd ever seen photographed that way. I don't know which of them was right. I've looked at those 4 frames more times than I can count, and I still don't know. I want to describe the conversation I had with Priya about those images in more detail than I have so far, because her reaction, which I only fully appreciated in hindsight, was more telling than her official written assessment let on. Over the phone, before she'd committed anything to writing, she spent a long moment just breathing before she answered my question about what she thought, and when she finally spoke, her voice had a careful, measured quality I recognized from her field reports but had never heard her use in ordinary conversation. She told me the bear explanation was the responsible one to put in writing, the one that wouldn't invite ridicule if the images ever ended up in front of her supervisor, and then, almost as an aside, in a tone she clearly hadn't planned on using, she added that she'd worked with black bears professionally for going on 15 years, had handled dozens in culvert traps for relocation, had necropsied more than she could easily count, and that whatever was casting that particular silhouette against the flash, if it was a bear, was standing in a way she had never once seen a bear stand, not in a photograph, not in the field, not in any of the literature she'd reviewed over her whole career. She asked me not to quote her on that, and I never have, until now. The static I'd been tracking since my 1st season also changed, subtly, sometime around my 6th or 7th year, in a way I only recognized clearly in retrospect once I compared notebook entries across seasons side by side one winter. The burst duration lengthened, from an average of 3 to 5 seconds in my early notes to closer to 7 or 8 seconds by mid-tenure, and the frequency of nights producing any static at all increased as well, from what I estimated at roughly one night in 4 during my first 2 seasons to something closer to one night in 2 by my 7th and 8th. I don't have hard data to back that estimate beyond my own notebook, kept faithfully but not with anything like scientific rigor, and I want to be honest that memory and expectation can shape a record like that in ways I can't fully rule out in myself. But the trend, for whatever it's worth, matched the same direction as everything else: the quiet patches, the trail camera triggers, Ruth Talbot's map, all of it pointing toward more, not less, as the years went on. What I can tell you is where the camera was mounted, and what that location was relative to Delbert Suggs' sinkhole. It was roughly 600 yards upslope from it, well inside Forest Service land, in a spot that, for years earlier, would have been well outside the boundary Delbert described his father fencing off. If his account of the quiet spreading over the decades was accurate, and I want to stress that this is a big if, then a trail camera 600 yards north of the old sink, capturing something strange in year 4 of my tenure, was not inconsistent with that spread. I moved that particular camera 3 weeks later, ostensibly to cover a different section of Priya's survey grid, though I'll admit the real reason was that I didn't like walking up to check it anymore. Before I relocated it, though, I let it run one more cycle, and the second set of images it produced were, in a way, more unsettling than the first, precisely because there was nothing dramatic in them at all. Across 9 consecutive nights, the camera had been triggered at almost exactly the same time each night, somewhere between 3:12 and 3:19 in the morning, by nothing that showed in the frame: no animal, no branch, no obvious motion, just an empty stretch of undergrowth lit up by infrared flash, over and over, at a consistency that no wild animal I've ever heard of would produce on its own. Motion sensors misfire, certainly, heat shimmer, insects near the lens, humidity, a branch settling after a rain. I know all the mundane explanations, every one of them, and I turned each over more than once, testing them the way you'd test a loose tooth, hoping one of them would hold. What I couldn't get past was the clock. 9 nights, same 9-minute window, give or take, as though something down there understood the camera's trigger radius and was testing its edge on a schedule of its own choosing. Season 5, The Hunter. My 5th season is the one where someone other than me had an experience frightening enough that they came looking for a Forest Service employee to report it to, which is how I ended up hearing this account directly and taking a statement, informally, the way lookouts sometimes do when the district office is a long drive away and something needs writing down before it's forgotten. It was November, technically after my official lookout season had ended, but I was still doing some backcountry patrol work covering for a coworker on leave, when a deer hunter named Wayne Pruitt came up the trail to my tower cabin looking, by his own description later, and by what I could see with my own eyes, badly shaken. He was a man in his 50s, hunted that section of the district most years, not someone I'd peg as easily rattled. He told me he'd been in a stand a little over a mile from the tower, in a finger ridge that ran down toward, though not directly into, the Coffin Creek drainage, sitting quiet in the last hour of legal light, when he heard his own name called from the woods below him. He was very specific that it was his name, not a generic shout, not a hunter's call, his actual first name, spoken clearly enough that his first instinct was that another hunter he knew was down there and needed help. He called back. Nothing answered for a moment, and then his name came again, from a different direction than the first time, closer, and something about the voice on the second call struck him as wrong in a way he had trouble putting into words when he told me about it. Something about the cadence, he said, like it was a recording of his name rather than someone actually saying it, right down to a strange flat quality on the vowel that his own voice, he was fairly sure, didn't actually have. He got down out of the stand, he told me, not because he'd decided anything was supernatural, but because his body had made the decision for him before his mind caught up, and he walked out to his truck faster than he'd walked anywhere in years, and he did not look back down into that hollow the whole way. He said that as he came up over the ridge toward the trailhead, he heard the call one more time, from well behind him now, and that this time it wasn't his name. It was, as best he could describe it, an attempt at a sound like a truck door closing, badly done, like something trying out a noise it had heard once and gotten close to, but not quite right. I wrote his account down that same evening while it was fresh, and I want to note something about my own reaction, because I think it's relevant. By that point, 5 seasons in, I did not for one second consider that Wayne Pruitt was lying to me or exaggerating for effect. I recognized the specific quality of fear in how he told it, the same quality I'd started to recognize in myself. It's a fear that comes with an apology built into it, a kind of I know how this sounds hedging, because the people it happens to know, better than anyone, how thin the line is between a credible witness and someone who sounds unhinged, and they hate that line, and they respect it, and they cross it anyway because the alternative is not telling anyone at all. Wayne didn't hunt that finger ridge again. I checked, in later years, and he'd moved his stand more than 2 miles east, into a different drainage entirely, and when I asked him about it once, years later, at a gas station down in the valley, he just said, "Some places aren't worth the deer," and didn't want to talk about it further. I want to add one more detail to Wayne's account that I left out of my official notes at the time, because it embarrassed me to write down, and I wasn't sure it belonged in a report meant for a district file. He told me that in the days after the incident, back home, he'd started noticing that his own voice, on his answering machine's outgoing message, an old habit he'd never bothered updating, sounded wrong to him in a way he couldn't explain, flat in the same place the Woods' voice had been flat. He re-recorded the message twice, he said, trying to fix whatever was bothering him about it, and gave up both times, because he couldn't identify what was actually different, only that something was, and in the end, he just stopped using an outgoing message at all. I don't offer that detail as proof of anything. I offer it because it stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this account. The idea that a man who'd only heard his name called wrong in the woods came home and started doubting the sound of his own voice on his own machine. A second witness, that same autumn. Wayne Pruitt's account wasn't the only one I collected that 5th season. About 6 weeks after he came up to my cabin, a backpacker doing a multi-day section of the Ozark Highlands Trail, a woman in her 30s named Renee who was hiking alone and had a permit on file with the district office, flagged me down on patrol looking, much like Wayne had, considerably more rattled than the trail conditions alone could explain. She told me she'd camped the previous night in a designated site about 1.5 miles from Coffin Creek, a site she'd used before without any trouble, and that sometime after midnight, she'd woken to the sound of her own tent zipper being worked, slowly, from the outside, a sound unmistakable to anyone who's spent real-time backpacking, because a tent zipper has a particular texture to its sound that nothing else quite replicates. She'd lain frozen, she said, gripping a knife she kept for camp chores, watching the zipper pull inch upward in the dark on its own, no hand visible through the thin fabric, no shadow cast by her small LED lantern that should have thrown some kind of silhouette if a person's arm had genuinely been reaching for it. She'd shouted, finally, more out of raw terror than strategy, and the zipper had stopped moving instantly, frozen maybe 8 inches open, and whatever had been pulling it did not retreat with any sound she could identify, simply stopped being present in the way a held breath stops when you finally exhale. She hadn't slept the rest of the night, had broken camp before first light, and had hiked out nearly 9 miles in a single push rather than spend a second night anywhere near that stretch of trail. When I examined her tent zipper myself, at her request, it worked perfectly, no damage, no debris, nothing to explain mechanically what she described. I noted her account in my file alongside Wayne's, Two witnesses in a single season, unconnected to each other, unconnected to me beyond both having crossed paths with the same stretch of ground. Seasons 6 and 7, a quiet stretch, and then the dog. I want to include seasons 6 and 7 together because season 6 was, by the standards of everything else in this account, almost entirely quiet, and I think that's worth including rather than skipping past, because part of what makes this pattern so hard to hold on to, even for me, even now, is that it doesn't happen all the time. There were long stretches, sometimes a full season, where the only thing I noted in my book was the ordinary summer quiet down toward Coffin Creek. No worse than any prior year. No calls. Nothing on the cameras. I want to describe what those quiet stretches actually did to me psychologically, because I think it's an underappreciated part of living through something like this. A single terrifying night is, in some ways, easier to carry than 18 quiet months, because a single night gives you a clear story to tell yourself, a bad night, an aberration, a thing you survived and can set down. 18 quiet months does something else entirely. It lets the earlier incidents soften at the edges, lets you start to wonder, seriously and at length, whether you'd overreacted, whether the elk really was just an elk, whether Delbert Suggs was simply an old man who'd absorbed his family's stories a little too completely and passed his own certainty on to me the way a persuasive person can pass certainty to anyone willing to listen closely enough. I spent a good part of that sixth season almost convincing myself of exactly that, rebuilding the comfortable, rational version of my job I'd had before my first season's early morning call, and I think, looking back, that this rebuilding is itself part of the pattern, whether by design or simply by the nature of long silence. Because season 7 arrived and undid all of that rebuilding in a single evening with Scout on the trail. Priya, the district biologist, had her own quiet season 6 moment that I only heard about secondhand, months after the fact, from a coworker who'd been helping her with a spring turkey survey. According to that account, Priya had been alone doing point count observations near the edge of the Coffin Creek drainage, well before dawn, standard practice for turkey surveys, when she'd become so overwhelmingly certain that she needed to leave the site immediately, with no identifiable trigger, no sound, no sighting, nothing she could point to afterward, that she'd packed up and left 40 minutes into a survey that was supposed to run 2 hours, something she'd never done in 9 years of, running that same protocol. When I finally asked her about it directly, the following year, she was noticeably reluctant to discuss it, professional caution winning out, I think, over whatever she'd actually felt that morning, and she said only that she'd had an off morning and didn't remember the details clearly enough to say anything more useful. I didn't push her. I recognized, by then, exactly what that kind of vagueness usually meant. Season 7 broke that quiet, and it did it through my own dog. I'd started bringing a dog up to the tower with me by then, a mixed-breed cattle dog named Scout that I'd had since she was a puppy, good in the woods, not spooky, not a barker for no reason. In August of that 7th season, Scout and I were coming back up the trail toward the tower a little after dusk, later than I usually liked to be out, when she stopped dead on the trail, hackles up along her whole spine, and would not go another step forward. I've had dogs my whole life. I know the difference between a dog that's caught a deer scent and a dog that's afraid. This was fear, complete and immediate, and it was pointed at a stretch of trail that ran along the rim above Coffin Creek, a stretch we'd walked probably 400 times without incident. I stood with her for a minute, my headlamp cutting a narrow cone into the dark, and I heard, from down in the hollow, a series of sounds that I can only describe as branches breaking in a pattern too regular to be wind or a falling limb, a rhythm to it, 3 cracks, a pause, 3 cracks again, like something testing whether the sound would draw a response. Scout would not move forward past that point no matter what I did. and in the end I turned us around and took the long way back to the tower, adding almost a mile to a walk that should have taken 20 minutes, and I did not feel foolish about it, not for 1 second, not with her flat against my leg trembling the whole way. After that night, Scout refused, permanently, to walk that stretch of trail. She'd go right up to a certain bend and sit down and would not be coaxed past it, not with treats, not with commands she otherwise obeyed without question. I rerouted my regular patrol to avoid asking her to do it. I'm not a person who reads too much into animal behavior as a rule, but 12 years of watching that dog make a single, consistent, unshakable exception in an otherwise obedient life taught me something I still can't fully put into words, except to say that I trusted her judgment on that trail more than I trusted my own. I want to describe one more thing from that 7th season, because it's the first time I found something I'd call physical trace that didn't come from a camera. A few days after the night with Scout, in full daylight, I went back to examine that bend in the trail more carefully than I had in the dark. In the soft mud just off the trail edge, in a spot no boot print I recognized had any business being, I found a single track, partial, degraded by a rain shower 2 nights prior enough that I couldn't call it clean evidence of anything. What I could see was a heel impression, deeper than my own boot left in the same mud when I stood beside it for comparison, and a stride length, judged against a second, fainter impression 11 feet further along. That was long enough to make me stand there doing the math twice, because 11 feet is a stride no person I've ever known could produce walking, and would be an unusually long stride even at a dead run on level ground. I photographed both impressions before the next rain took them for good, and I sent the photos to Priya, who forwarded them, out of professional caution, to a colleague at a state wildlife agency who studied black bear gait patterns. His response, which I still have saved, was that the heel depth was consistent with a bear rearing briefly onto 2 legs, but that the stride length between the 2 impressions did not match any bipedal bear movement pattern he was aware of being documented anywhere, and that his best guess, offered with visible reluctance, was that the second print might simply be unrelated to the first, a coincidence of 2 different animals in the same stretch of mud. I've never found that explanation satisfying, and I don't think, reading between the lines of his reply, that he fully believed it either. Season 8, The Second Sink. In my 8th season, a Forest Service survey crew came through doing cave inventory work, part of a broader karst mapping project across the district, and in the course of their work they identified and flagged a second collapse feature, a smaller sink about 3/4 of a mile northeast of Delbert Suggs's old family sink, well inside the boundary that, by Delbert's account, would have been safely outside whatever range his grandfather had known. That same crew came back through the district 3 years later, in what would have been my 11th season, for a follow-up phase of the same karst mapping project, and I made a point of meeting them at the trailhead when they came through, curious whether they'd found anything further. The crew lead by then was a different person, a methodical, unflappable man named Alvaro who'd mapped cave systems on 3 continents and did not, by his own description, spook easily. He told me they'd identified a 3rd minor collapse feature that season, smaller still than the second sink, a partial subsidence rather than a full collapse, situated less than a mile from Hurricane Point itself, close enough that I recognized the coordinates he read off his GPS unit as a spot I had personally walked past on patrol dozens of times without ever noticing anything unusual about the ground underfoot. Alvaro didn't offer me any ghost story to go with it, and I didn't ask him for one, but he did mention, almost as a technical aside while packing up his gear, that his crew's ground-penetrating radar survey of that new subsidence feature had returned some of the strangest void readings he'd seen in over a decade of similar work. Air pockets and passage geometry that didn't correlate cleanly with anything visible at the surface, extending, by his instrument's estimate, considerably further underground than the surface depression alone would suggest, in a direction that, when he sketched it roughly for me on a paper map, trended generally northwest, back toward the original Suggs sink and the second sink beyond it, as though all three features might eventually connect into a single continuous void system running beneath a significant stretch of the district I had spent over a decade of my life walking on top of without ever fully understanding what was underneath me. I mention this because it lines up, again, with the idea of an expanding zone. Though I want to be careful here, because sinkholes are common across karst country like the Ozarks, and finding a second one doesn't prove anything on its own beyond ordinary geology. What I can tell you is that the survey crew, 3 of them, experienced cavers who'd mapped systems across 4 states, spent one night camped near that second sink before deciding, without much discussion among themselves, to relocate their camp nearly 2 miles away the following night. When I asked their crew lead about it afterward, over the radio a few days later, she was evasive in a way that struck me as familiar, the same hedging quality Wayne Pruitt had used. She said only that the acoustics down in that hollow were doing something weird with sound at night, and that none of them had slept well, and she didn't want to get into it further on an open channel, adding, before she signed off, that in 15 years of professional caving across 4 states, she had exactly 2 other sites in her personal experience that had ever prompted a whole crew to relocate camp without a single dissenting vote, and that she'd rather not say where those other 2 sites were, on the radio or otherwise. I didn't press her. By that point, I understood the impulse not to say more than you have to. I did, however, manage a longer conversation with one member of that crew separately, a caver named Josh who I ran into the following spring at a district training, away from his crew lead, and, I think, more willing to talk because of it. He told me that on their one night camped near the second sink, he'd gone off alone a short distance from the tents to relieve himself, and that his headlamp beam, sweeping the treeling out of habit, had caught what he described as 2-point sources of reflected light low to the ground, roughly 40 yards off, spaced at a distance that read, instinctively, as too wide for a raccoon or bobcat and too narrow for a deer, and that the reflection had held steady in his light for a full 2 or 3 seconds, long enough that he was certain it wasn't a trick of foliage, before both points simply winked out together, not blinking, not turning away, just gone, as though something had closed its eyes or the light itself had stopped finding anything to reflect off of. He said he hadn't told his crew lead the full detail of it, only that he'd seen eye shine and didn't want to camp that close again, because he didn't have a good explanation for the spacing and didn't want to be the guy on the crew who'd spooked everyone over nothing. He asked me, at the end of telling me all this, whether I'd ever seen anything like it myself. I told him I hadn't, which was true in the narrowest possible sense, and let it go at that. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought while we were packing up to leave the training session, that he'd since taken a job with a mapping firm doing contract work mostly in developed, populated country, and that he didn't miss backcountry car survey work at all, a comment he delivered lightly enough that I might have missed the weight behind it if I hadn't, by then, spent years learning to hear that particular kind of lightness for what it usually meant. A pattern in the staffing records. Sometime in my 8th season, restless one rainy week when smoke watch was pointless and patrol was miserable, I did something I probably should have done years earlier. I put in a request to the district office, framed as idle historical curiosity, for the staffing records of Hurricane Point going back as far as they'd been kept, wanting to know who had held the lookout position before me and for how long each of them had lasted. The records were incomplete before the 1960s, but from the 1960s forward, they were reasonably thorough: names, start dates, end dates, and occasionally a brief note on the reason for departure. What I found unsettled me more than almost anything else I'd gathered by that point, because it was the first piece of evidence that didn't rely on anyone's memory or interpretation, just plain administrative fact. Of the 11 people who had staffed Hurricane Point before me across roughly 60 years of records, 7 had left the position inside of 3 seasons, several with departure notes using language I now recognized instantly. Personal reasons, family circumstances. One blunt entry from 1974 that simply read, requested immediate reassignment. No explanation given. Only 2 lookouts before me, going back that far, had stayed longer than 8 seasons, and one of those 2, a man who'd held the post through most of the 1980s, had a final entry noting that he'd retired from the Forest Service entirely rather than accept reassignment to any other tower in the district, which struck me, reading it alone in my cab one rainy afternoon, as a strange thing for a man to do unless staying near that particular ridge, for reasons of his own, had mattered to him more than the job itself. I tried, a few times over the following seasons, to track down any of the more recent former lookouts, the ones from the 1990s and 2000s whose names were recent enough that a phone number might still exist somewhere. I managed to reach exactly one, a woman then in her 60s living in Missouri, who had staffed Hurricane Point for 2 seasons in the early 1990s. She was polite on the phone, and then, the moment I mentioned the tower by name, she went quiet in a way I'd come to recognize by then, and told me, not unkindly, that she didn't discuss that job anymore and would appreciate it if I didn't call again. I didn't. I understood, by that point in my own tenure, exactly the kind of boundary she was drawing, and I respected it more than I resented it. I'm going to spend more time on my 9th and 10th seasons than on the earlier ones, because this is where the pattern, whatever it was, stopped staying at a comfortable distance and started, unmistakably, coming toward the tower itself. In my 9th season, in late September, on a night with a low, wet fog sitting in all the hollows the way it sometimes does after a warm day and a cool front, I woke somewhere around 2 in the morning to the sound of the tower stairs. I want to describe that sound precisely, because after 6 years living with it, I knew every sound that tower could make, every wind-driven creak, every settling groan of steel in temperature change. This was not that. This was the specific, weighted sound of a footstep, once, on a step roughly a third of the way up, followed by a long pause, and then another step, higher, another long pause. I lay very still in the cab, and I want to be honest that what I felt was not the sharp jolt of ordinary fear so much as a cold, total stillness, the kind where your body seems to understand, ahead of your mind, that moving or making noise would be the wrong choice. I counted, in my head, without meaning to, the way you count without meaning to when you've spent 6 years learning a set of stairs. Whatever was on them was taking its time, and it was taking a person's stride length, roughly, between steps, but a person does not pause for what felt like 30 or 40 seconds between each one. The steps stopped, by my count, around the 40th stair, a little over halfway up. And then, for a long time, nothing. No retreat, no continuation. Just the fog, and Scout pressed rigid against me on the floor of the cab, not growling, which she almost always did at anything approaching the tower, just breathing hard and fast and small, the way a dog breathes when it has decided that noise is the wrong choice too. I want to try to convey what that waiting actually felt like, because I think the word afraid undersells it, and I've had years to find a better one and never quite have. It was less like fear and more like a physical awareness of scale, the way you feel small standing at the rim of a canyon, except the canyon, in this case, was a silence with a weight to it, pressing in through the steel walls of a cab I had, until that night, always thought of as the safest place in the whole district. I remember becoming aware of my own heartbeat as an external sound, audible, I was sure, to anything listening from the stairwell, and I remember the specific, useless thought that occurred to me somewhere in the middle of all that waiting. which was that I had spent 8.5 years learning every ordinary sound that tower could make specifically so that I would know, immediately and without doubt, the one night a sound didn't belong. I had built myself a very good alarm system, and it had just gone off, and there was nothing at all I could do with that information except lie still and wait for morning. I don't know how long we lay there. Long enough that the fog outside the cab windows had shifted, thinned in places, by the time I worked up the nerve to look. When I finally did look down the stairwell with my headlamp, there was nothing there. No one on the stairs, no sign that anyone had been. In the morning, first light, I went down and examined every step, and there was nothing to find, no mud, no disturbance in the light dust that collected on the steel treads, nothing that should not have been there if someone, or something, had genuinely climbed 40 steps of my tower in the dark. I want to sit with that lack of physical trace for a moment, because I think it matters. Almost everything else in this account has some corroborating detail attached to it: a trail camera frame, an old man's story, a hunter's account, a dog's fear. That night, I have nothing but the sound and my own certainty, and I understand completely if that's the part of this you find hardest to accept, because it's the part one find hardest to accept myself, even now, even having lived it. I didn't tell the district office about that night. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't fear of being disbelieved, though that was part of it. It was that I genuinely did not know how to file a report on it that wouldn't sound like a request to be pulled from the tower, and pulling myself from the tower was the one outcome I was, at that point in my life, least prepared to accept. I had built an entire identity around being the kind of person who could sit alone on a ridge for 6 months at a stretch without it touching me. Admitting that something up there had gotten inside that identity, even a little, felt like a larger loss than whatever risk I was choosing to keep quiet about. I've thought since that this is probably exactly the kind of reasoning whatever lives down in that hollow depends on, patient enough to let a person's own pride do half its work. There was a coworker, a younger lookout named Marcus, who relieved me for 11 days that same season while I took leave to attend a family wedding, and though I never told him the details of what had happened on the stairs, I did mention, in the vague, deniable way you tell someone something without really telling them, that the tower could get a little strange some nights and that he shouldn't worry about odd sounds on the stairwell in fog. He laughed it off at the time. When I came back, he mentioned, almost in passing while helping me restock the propane, that he'd had one bad night, fog again, where he'd heard what he assumed was a raccoon getting into something down at the cabin, gone down with a flashlight to check, and found nothing disturbed at all, no cabin door ajar, no trash bin knocked over, nothing to explain a sound he was certain hadn't been the wind. He didn't seem shaken by it the way Wayne or Renee had been, and I've wondered since whether that was because 11 days wasn't long enough for whatever this is to properly register a new voice, a new person to work on, or whether Marcus was simply a less noticing kind of person than I was, someone Delbert's father would have called, without meaning it unkindly, one of the safe ones. Season 10, the following year, was quieter for most of the summer, and then, in early October, right at the tail end of my rotation, it happened again, except this time the steps did not stop at the 40th stair. I heard them all the way to the top, to the small landing just outside the cab door, a distance I had, by then, absolutely memorized, and they stopped there, right outside, close enough that I could hear, or believed I could hear, breathing on the other side of a door that was, I want to be very clear, locked, an old hook-and-eye latch that I had never once in 9.5 years bothered to use before that night, and had used, without quite deciding to, every night since the 40th stair incident the year before. I did not open that door. I sat with my back against the wall of the cab, as far from it as the small space allowed, for the rest of the night, and at some point before dawn, without any sound of departure that I heard. Whatever had been there was simply not there anymore. I know that because when the light came up enough to see, I made myself look through the small window in the door, and the landing was empty, and the dew that had settled on the landing's steel grating overnight was undisturbed, unbroken, exactly as smooth as it would have been if no one had stood on it at all. That absence of dew disturbance bothered me more, in the weeks that followed, than almost anything else in this entire account, more than the trail camera frames, more than the 11-foot stride in the mud. A grown adult, or anything of comparable mass, standing motionless on a steel grating landing for what I judged to have been at least 20 minutes, in heavy overnight dew, should leave some trace, some flattened pattern in the moisture, some scuff where a shifted foot broke the film of water. I got down on my hands and knees that morning and studied every inch of that landing in good light, and I found nothing, and the nothing itself felt, for the first time in 9 years, less like an absence of evidence, and more like evidence of something that did not weigh on the world the way the rest of us do, at least not while it was choosing not to. I requested a transfer to a different tower within the district that winter, a smaller lookout on the far southern end, nearly 14 miles from Hurricane Point, and I want to be honest that I told myself, filling out that paperwork, that it was about wanting a change of scenery after 9 years in one spot, and not about anything else. The transfer came through, and I spent that 10th season at the Southern Tower instead, and it was, for that entire season, uneventful in every way that mattered, no quiet patches, no static, no steps on any stairs, and I let myself believe, for most of a year, that distance alone had solved whatever problem I'd been carrying. That belief lasted exactly as long as it took the district to reorganize its staffing the following winter. Budget cuts had eliminated one of the 2 smaller lookouts on the southern end, and the district supervisor, apologetic but firm, told me the only tower with a season available for someone with my seniority was Hurricane Point, whose most recent occupant had put in for a transfer of her own after just 2 seasons, for reasons the supervisor described only as personal. I told myself that was a coincidence. I did not entirely believe that either, but I needed the work, and I told myself 9 years was long enough to have earned some kind of understanding with whatever was down in that hollow, an understanding I now recognize as exactly the kind of quiet, comfortable arrogance Delbert's father would have warned me against, if I'd known then to ask him. Season 11, Local Knowledge, again. I went to see Delbert Suggs again early in my 11th season, older himself by then, slower, but still sharp, and I told him, for the first time in all our years of knowing each other, the full account of what had happened at the tower. He listened without interrupting, the way people from that country listen to things they already half expect to hear, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he told me something he hadn't told me before, something his father had apparently told him and told him to keep to himself unless it became necessary. He said the old belief wasn't only that the thing in the sink could learn a voice, but that it had a kind of patience to it that didn't match anything human, that it would spend years, sometimes a whole person's lifetime, closing a distance a few feet at a time, testing, retreating, testing again, the way water finds its way through rock, not through force but through time. He said his father believed the reason it never seemed to finish the job, never seemed to actually arrive at whatever it was working toward, was that it wasn't in any hurry, that whatever measure of time it worked on wasn't ours. He also told me, and this is the part that has stayed with me the longest, that the old family's rule wasn't just about not answering a call. It was about never, under any circumstance, letting it learn that you knew it was there, because recognition, in the old belief, was its own kind of invitation. He said his father used to say that the safest people in these hollows were the ones who genuinely didn't believe, because belief and attention were the same thing to whatever this was. And the moment you started keeping a notebook, watching the quiet patches, timing the static on your radio, you had already, in the oldest sense of the word, answered. I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't entirely. I kept the notebook anyway. I think, by that point, stopping would have felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. Before I left his porch that day, Delbert told me about one more person I should talk to if I wanted to understand how far back this went. A woman named Ruth Talbot, who ran the small county museum out of a converted feed store in town, who had, over decades of collecting, put together the closest thing the area had to a formal archive of the old family's accounts. I drove out to see her the following week. She was younger than Delbert, maybe 60, brisk and practical in the way people get who've spent a career being the only person willing to take local superstition seriously enough to write it down without laughing at it. She pulled a thin folder from a filing cabinet in the back room, hand-labeled in a heading that just said Boston Mountains, unusual, and walked me through it at her work table. There were 4 separate family accounts in that folder, collected over roughly 30 years of her own interviewing, from families scattered across a stretch of the district that, when she laid it out on a topographic map for me, formed a rough, elongated shape running from a point a mile or so south of the original Suggs Sink, all the way north, past the second sink the cave crew had flagged, to within 2.5 miles of Hurricane Point itself. She hadn't drawn any conclusions from that shape herself, she told me. She was careful, professionally, not to draw conclusions at all, but she let me sit with the map long enough to draw my own, and what I drew was a line of expansion running almost directly toward the tower I had spent 9 years of my life sleeping in. She told me one account in particular that she said she'd never been able to verify, but had heard from 2 unrelated families independently, decades apart, involving a missing hunter from sometime in the 1950s, a man whose dog had come home alone, agitated, refusing to eat for days, and whose own boot prints, according to the search party's account passed down through Ruth's interviews, had been tracked to the edge of a hollow and simply stopped. No sign of a fall, no sign of a struggle, no body ever recovered despite what she described as an unusually thorough search for the era, involving men from 3 counties over the better part of 2 weeks. She was careful to tell me that missing person cases from that period are rarely as clean as the stories that survive them, that records were poor, that families sometimes embellished or simplified over the generations in the retelling. She was equally careful to tell me that she had heard some version of that same man's name, and some version of that same hollow, from 2 families who, as far as she'd ever been able to determine, had no contact with each other and no reason to have invented the same detail independently. Season 12, and Why I Left. My 12th and final season started ordinarily enough, and for the first 2 months I let myself hope, the way you do, that the pattern had run its course, that whatever had climbed to the 40th stair and then, a year later, to the landing outside my door, had reached some limit and would recede the way the earlier incidents sometimes seemed to. It didn't recede. In late July, on a clear night with no fog at all, which I note because fog had been present, in some degree, at nearly every prior serious incident, I woke to find the cab door standing open. Not forced. Not damaged. The hook and eye latch I'd used every single night for 2 full years was undone, sitting neatly disengaged, as though someone had lifted it free with careful, deliberate fingers rather than force. Scout was not pressed against me that night. Scout was at the open door, absolutely still, staring out into the dark of the landing, and she did not bark, and she did not growl, and after a moment, she backed away from the door and came to me, and would not leave my side for the rest of the night. I did not see anything on the landing. I want to say that clearly, because I think it's important, after everything, to be honest that I have never, across 12 years, actually seen a shape, a face, a clear outline of anything. What I had, that night, was an open door that should not have been open, and a dog who had looked at whatever was there and chosen retreat over challenge for the first time in her life, and a feeling, standing in that small steel cab at 2 in the morning, that whatever Patience Delbert's father had described had, after 12 years, arrived at wherever it had been heading. I want to describe the weeks between that night and my transfer request because I don't think the account is complete without them, and because I've never told anyone, not the district office, not my own family, the full shape of what those weeks were actually like to live through. I did not sleep in the cab again. I moved my sleeping bag down into the small base cabin, which felt, at the time, like a reasonable compromise, lower ground, closer to the trailhead, less exposed. It took only 4 nights in the cabin to understand that the compromise had not solved anything. On the second night, I woke to a sound at the cabin's single window, not a knock, nothing so crude as a knock, but a slow, deliberate dragging across the outside of the glass, a texture I can only compare to a fingernail pulled with real patience across a pane, back and forth, 3 times, before stopping. I did not look. I want to be honest about that. I have never, in 12 years, actually looked at whatever has been on the other side of a barrier from me at the moment it was closest, and I've come to believe that refusal, however cowardly it might sound, is the single decision that kept me able to write any of this down at all. On the 4th night in the cabin, Scout began pacing, something she had never done indoors in her whole life, a tight, repetitive circuit between the door and the foot of my sleeping bag, for nearly 2 hours, stopping only when the first gray light came up through the window. I did not wait for a 5th night. I drove down off the mountain the next morning, ostensibly for supplies, and I did not go back up for 4 days, the longest I had ever left the tower unstaffed during fire season in 11 years, a lapse serious enough that my supervisor called to ask if everything was all right. I told him I'd had a stomach virus. He didn't question it. I've wondered since whether he'd have believed me if I'd told him the truth, and I've decided, on balance, that it doesn't matter, because I wouldn't have told him regardless. I made up the 4 days some other way in my logs. Minor administrative fiction I'm not proud of, and nobody ever questioned it. And I've carried a small, persistent guilt about that dishonesty ever since, disproportionate, probably, to how minor a lie it actually was, but the kind of guilt that lingers precisely because it sits right next to something much larger I was also choosing not to say out loud. I put in my transfer request 3 weeks later, before the season had officially ended, which I had never done before in 11 prior years. I told my district supervisor it was for personal reasons, family, a need to be closer to aging parents, all of which was partially true and none of which was the actual reason. I have not been back to Hurricane Point since, though I know, because I still talk to a couple of people in that district, that the tower is still staffed by someone else now, a younger lookout who I've never met and have deliberately never reached out to, because I don't know what I'd say, and because I remember what Delbert told me about recognition being its own kind of invitation, and I've decided, for whatever that decision is worth, not to extend that invitation to a stranger on my behalf. I did, before I left the district for good, drive out one last time to see Delbert. He was in poor health by then, and I suspect, though neither of us said it directly, that we both understood it was likely the last conversation we'd have. I told him about the open door, about the fingernail sound on the cabin window, about Scout's pacing. He listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, and when I finished, he didn't offer any new piece of folklore, any new fragment of his father's warnings. He just nodded, slow, and said that 12 years was longer than most people lasted up there once it had noticed them, and that he thought I'd been smart, or lucky, or both, to leave when I had. I asked him, because I'd never quite worked up the nerve to ask directly before, whether he thought it could follow a person, once it had learned them well enough. He was quiet for a long moment, And then he said the only thing on this whole subject he ever told me that sounded less like inherited folklore and more like a plain, personal fear he'd carried his whole life without resolving. He said he didn't know, and that not knowing was the part he'd never gotten used to, not in 70-some years of living beside it. He died a little over a year later, and I heard about it secondhand, from a mutual acquaintance, months after the fact, too late to have made the drive back for the funeral even if I'd have trusted myself to go. I think about that conversation on his porch more than almost any other single memory from those 12 years, an old man who had lived his entire life within a few miles of that hollow, admitting, finally, near the very end, that the not knowing had never once gotten easier, and I've come to think that admission is the most honest thing anyone ever told me about this whole subject, more honest, in its way, than any of the folklore, any of the camera frames, any of my own careful notes. What I tell people now. I still work in the woods. I moved to a different state, a different kind of terrain entirely, mountains without the particular karst geology the Ozarks have, without the caves, without, as far as I know, whatever it was that lived, or lives, in that hollow below Hurricane Point. I've asked myself, more times than I can count, whether I owed anyone a formal report before I left, something written up for the district office, something that would go into a permanent file the way Wayne's account and Renee's account went into my own informal notes. I never wrote one. Part of that was self-protective, plainly, a wish to leave the agency with a clean record rather than one flagged, however quietly, as the guy who filed a report about footsteps on the stairs. But part of it, the part one find harder to admit, was that I genuinely did not know what such a report would accomplish. It would not close the tower. Towers like Hurricane Point are too valuable for fire detection to close over an account with no hard evidence behind it, certainly not evidence as thin as mine, a few ambiguous camera frames, a handful of secondhand witness statements, a personal certainty about sounds on a staircase that left no trace by morning. All it would have done, as far as I could see, was follow me, attached permanently to my name in a federal personnel file, available to any future employer who cared to ask why our experienced, otherwise unremarkable lookout had once filed a report describing what amounted to a haunting. I chose silence instead, and I've made my peace with that choice, though peace might be too strong a word for what I actually feel about it. Some years later, writing all of this down anyway, for an audience I don't know and will likely never meet. I don't know if it's still there. I don't know if it was ever anywhere in the way we usually mean that word, in a body, in a fixed location, waiting the way a predator waits. I've come to think that's the wrong question, the same way Delbert's father seems to have thought it was the wrong question, and that the right question, if there is one, has more to do with patience and distance and the particular danger of being noticed than it does with what a thing actually is. If you spend time in wild country, and especially if you spend time in old karst country, in hollows with names like Coffin Creek and Slaughter Hollow, I'll tell you the only practical advice I have, the same advice Wayne Pruitt gave me without meaning to, and the same advice Delbert's family passed down for longer than any of us can verify. If something calls your name from ground you can't see into, don't answer it. If a dog you trust refuses a trail it's walked 100 times before, don't make it walk that trail again. And if you ever find yourself keeping careful notes on a pattern of small, explainable, forgettable things, ask yourself, honestly, whether the noticing itself might be the thing you should be more careful with. I'd add a few more practical points, things I've come to hold as rules for myself regardless of what state or forest I'm working in now. Don't camp within easy earshot of a known sink or collapse feature if you can help it, and if you don't know whether one is nearby, treat any stretch of ground that goes unnaturally quiet, all at once, the way you treat a rattlesnake you heard but couldn't see, with total and immediate respect rather than curiosity. Don't investigate a strange call at night alone. And if you're with a dog who plants its feet and won't go forward, don't override that decision to save yourself an extra mile of walking. Because I promise you the extra mile has never once, in any account I've collected over 12 years, been the thing that got someone hurt. And if you ever do have an experience like the ones I've described here, I'd encourage you to write it down, carefully, factually, the way I did. But I'd also encourage you to think hard, the way I never quite managed to until it was almost too late, about whether the writing down is for your own benefit or an audience you haven't fully accounted for. I think about Ruth Talbot's map more than almost anything else from those 12 years, that elongated shape of old accounts stretching north across decades toward a tower I lived in for most of my adult life. And I think about the fact that nobody, as far as I know, has ever gone back and drawn that same map with my own tenure added to it, my own line of incidents laid over hers, to see how far the shape has grown since I left. I've thought about doing it myself, more than once, sitting at my kitchen table in a different state entirely, pulling up satellite images of a ridge I used to know better than my own house. I've never actually done it. I think, after everything Delbert told me about recognition and attention and the particular danger of being noticed, some part of me understands that drawing that map to its logical conclusion is exactly the kind of noticing I was warned against, and I'd rather live with an unfinished picture than find out, from the safety of a kitchen table 500 miles away, exactly how close that shape has crept to wherever I'm sitting now. I'm still out here. I still work the woods for a living, still spend more nights alone under open sky than most people spend in a year. I'm not going to stop doing that, because it's the only work I've ever wanted to do, and because 12 years taught me that the wild country that scares you is usually not the part that's actually dangerous. But I keep my own rules now, quiet ones, rules I don't explain to coworkers who ask why I never hike alone after dark anymore, why I still, in a state with no karst geology at all, glance twice at any hollow that goes quiet too fast. Sometimes, on a still night at my current post, hundreds of miles from anything Delbert Suggs or Ruth Talbot ever described to me, I'll catch a stretch of ground going quiet the way Coffin Creek used to, and I'll feel the old response rise in me before my rational mind has caught up to it, the same stillness, the same instinct to stop moving and simply wait it out. It has never, in the years since I left the Ozarks, amounted to anything. I tell myself that's because whatever lived in that hollow was tied to that particular ground, that particular void system Alvaro's radar traced beneath the district, and not to me personally, and most days I believe that completely. But I keep the old habits anyway, because 12 years taught me that the cost of keeping them, a little extra caution, a slightly longer route, a refusal to answer a voice I can't place, is so small compared to the alternative that there's no honest argument for setting them down, whether or not anything is actually still listening for me to do it.